The mid to late 1990s were a special time. The Cold War had ended, gas was cheap, and the economy was booming. Websites were making people millionaires practically overnight, and the battle for the dominant handheld gaming console was far from over. Technology was improving rapidly, and color screens were becoming more affordable. Developers were finding new ways to bring console-quality experiences to portable systems, and several companies believed they finally had what it took to dethrone Nintendo.
So let's travel back to the mid-1990s and explore what I like to call the forgotten era of handheld gaming.
By 1995, Sega was no longer the scrappy challenger that had shocked the gaming industry at the beginning of the decade. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, Sega had accomplished what many thought was impossible. They had challenged Nintendo, and in some markets, they even beat them. The Sega Genesis had become one of the defining consoles of its generation. With aggressive marketing, arcade-style experiences, and the explosive popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega had transformed itself from an underdog into a serious competitor. The company had built its reputation on doing things differently. When Nintendo zigged, Sega zagged. When competitors played it safe, Sega took risks.
And nowhere was that more apparent than their handheld strategy. And unfortunately for Sega, their handheld efforts hadn't exactly gone to plan.
Back in 1990, Sega launched the Game Gear as a direct competitor to Nintendo's Game Boy. On paper, the Game Gear looked superior. It featured a full-color backlit screen, more advanced hardware, and graphics that often surpassed Nintendo's aging handheld. But those advantages came with trade-offs. The system was larger, more expensive, and notoriously hungry for batteries. While Game Boy owners often could play for 10 or more hours on a set of batteries, Game Gear owners frequently found themselves searching for replacements only after a few hours of gameplay. Despite selling millions of units worldwide, the Game Gear never seriously threatened Nintendo's dominance. As the years passed, Sega continued searching for a way to break through in the portable gaming market. The answer arrived in October of '95. Known internally during development as Project Venus, the Sega Nomad was unlike any handheld that Sega had put on the market before. At first glance, it looked similar to other portable gaming devices of the era, but beneath the shell, there was something extraordinary. The Nomad wasn't based on the Genesis, it essentially was a Genesis. And because of that, the Nomad could play actual Genesis cartridges, not special portable versions, not scaled-down adaptations, just the real games. Players could insert Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, Shinobi, Phantasy Star 4, or hundreds of other Genesis titles and play them on the go. Today, portable versions of home consoles are common. The Nintendo Switch has built its entire identity around that concept. But in 1995, this was still revolutionary. The idea of carrying a home console library around with you wherever you wanted felt almost futuristic, and for many gamers, it seemed like the ultimate handheld. The Nomad featured a color LCD screen, a 6-button controller layout, stereo sound through headphones, and even something almost unheard of for a handheld system at the time: video output. Using an optional cable, players could connect the Nomad directly to a television and use it almost like a traditional Genesis console. Even more impressive, the system included a second controller port. That meant multiplayer gaming was possible without additional hardware. Think about that for a moment. In 1995, Sega had released a handheld capable of playing Genesis games connecting to a television and supporting multiplayer.
This was an astounding piece of engineering, and many retro gaming enthusiasts still consider it one of the most ambitious handhelds to this day. But unfortunately for Sega, ambition and commercial success don't always equal the same thing.
One of the Nomad's biggest problems had nothing to do with hardware itself. It was released at exactly the wrong time. By late 1995, Sega was already focused on the future, and they had released the Sega Saturn earlier that year. The company was investing enormous resources into competing with Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's upcoming Nintendo 64, and as a result, the Nomad often felt like an afterthought. Marketing support was limited, retailers weren't sure how heavily to promote it, and consumers were increasingly looking towards next-generation gaming experiences. The Nomad was asking players to invest in Genesis technology just as the industry was moving beyond the 16-bit era.
To make matters worse, the Genesis itself was beginning to lose momentum. For many gamers, purchasing a portable version of an aging console simply wasn't a priority. Then there was the issue that haunted Sega's handhelds for years: battery life. The Nomad required 6 AA batteries, and depending on the game, those batteries often lasted only just a few hours. This was a familiar problem for Sega. The company's engineers consistently prioritized performance and visual quality over power efficiency. As a result, Sega's handhelds often looked more impressive than Nintendo's hardware, but they were far less practical for long trips. Nintendo's Game Boy continued to dominate because it fit naturally into everyday life. You could throw it into a backpack, take it on a road trip, and expect to keep it working. Commercially, the Nomad was a disappointment. Sales never reached Sega's expectations. The system remained exclusive to North America and never reached a worldwide rollout. Before long, Sega shifted its attention entirely towards other projects. Yet over time, perceptions of the Nomad began to change. As retro gaming enthusiasts rediscovered the system, many came to appreciate just how ambitious it really was. Years before the PSP, years before the Steam Deck, and years before the Nintendo Switch, Sega had attempted to bring true console gaming into portable form factor. In many ways, the Nomad feels less like a product from 1995 and more like a glimpse of handheld gaming's future. At a time when Sega was attempting to put a home console in your pocket, another company was preparing a very different challenge to Nintendo, a company that most gamers already knew. That company was Tiger Electronics, and for many kids growing up in the 80s and 90s, Tiger Electronics was everywhere. Walk into almost any toy store and you'd find their handheld LCD games lining the shelves. Whether it was Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden, RoboCop, The Little Mermaid, or dozens of other licensed titles, Tiger had built an empire on creating affordable electronic games that could fit in your backpack or jacket pocket. To be fair, these weren't exactly what most people would consider video games today. The screens consisted of pre-drawn LCD segments that simply turned on and off to create the illusion of movement. Characters often jumped between fixed positions rather than moving smoothly across the screen. Yet, despite their limitations, Tiger's handhelds sold incredibly well. They were inexpensive, widely available, and offered kids a portable gaming experience at a time when not everyone could afford a Nintendo Game Boy. And because of this, by the mid-1990s, Tiger Electronics had become a major player in the toy and handheld electronics industry, and the company had bigger ambitions. Rather than producing another LCD game, Tiger wanted to create something that could compete directly with Nintendo's Game Boy. The result would be a system called the Game.com. Released in September of 1997, the Game.com entered a market that Nintendo had largely controlled for nearly a decade. On paper, Tiger's new handheld sounded incredibly impressive. In fact, some of its features wouldn't become common in portable gaming until years later. The most notable feature was its touchscreen. Long before the Nintendo DS popularized touchscreen controls, the Game.com shipped with a restrictive touchscreen and included stylus support. Players could tap icons, navigate menus, and interact with software directly on the screen. But Tiger wasn't finished. The company also envisioned the Game.com as more than just a gaming device. It was marketed as a portable communications platform. Optional accessories allowed users to connect a modem to the handheld. This enabled limited internet access, email functionality, and web browsing. By modern standards, this internet experience was extremely primitive. But remember, this was happening years before smartphones existed, years before wireless internet became common, and years before anyone imagined carrying a connected device in their pocket was going to be an everyday experience. And in some ways, the Game.com was attempting to predict that future. Unfortunately, predicting the future and successfully building it are two very different things. Tiger understood that hardware alone wouldn't sell a new gaming platform. The company needed recognizable software, and surprisingly, they managed to secure some major licenses. The Game.com library included titles based on popular franchises such as Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Duke Nukem 3D, Resident Evil 2, Sonic Jam, Fighters Megamix, and Wheel of Fortune. At first glance, these games looked impressive on the back of the box. Seeing names like Resident Evil and Duke Nukem on a handheld in the late 90s certainly caught people's attention. But once players actually started playing the games, the system's biggest problem suddenly became apparent, and that was the screen. If there was one thing that ultimately doomed the Game.com, it was the display. The monochrome touchscreen suffered from extremely slow refresh rates. The motion blur was just horrible. Fast-moving objects left noticeable trails behind them. Animation often appeared blurry and difficult to follow. Action games became frustrating because players could struggle just to track what was going on the screen. Even titles with impressive concepts felt sluggish and unresponsive. This was especially frustrating because many of the games Tiger was promoting relied on fast-paced gameplay. Fighting games, action games, platformers, all genres that demanded quick visual feedback. The hardware simply couldn't keep up. Reviewers were quick to point out these issues. While many praised the system's ambitious feature set, they also criticized the display and limited software quality. Consumers largely agreed. Despite its innovative ideas, the Game.com failed to gain significant traction in the marketplace. What's fascinating about the Game.com today is how many of its ideas would eventually become standard features. The idea of combining gaming with communication features has become commonplace. In many ways, Tiger Electronics identified trends that the rest of the industry would eventually follow. The problem wasn't vision, the problem was execution. The technology simply wasn't ready. The hardware couldn't fully deliver on the promises that Tiger was making, and consumers weren't willing to overlook those shortcomings. Tiger continued supporting the platform for a few more years, releasing additional games and even revised hardware models. But the momentum never materialized. Sales remained disappointing, third-party support was limited, and Nintendo continued to dominate the handheld market. By the turn of the millennium, the Game.com had effectively disappeared from store shelves. It joined a growing list of handheld systems that had tried and failed to challenge Nintendo's dominance. Yet unlike many of the forgotten gaming platforms, the Game.com left behind something more than just a cautionary tale. It left behind a collection of ideas that would eventually become mainstream, ideas that millions of people now use every day. Because while the Game.com may not have been successful, it was surprisingly good at seeing where technology was headed. By the late 1990s, the original Game Boy had already become one of the biggest success stories in gaming history. Released in 1989, Nintendo's little gray handheld had survived challenge after challenge. It had outlasted the technologically superior Atari Lynx, it had survived Sega's colorful and powerful Game Gear, and it had become a cultural phenomenon thanks to games like Tetris, Super Mario Land, and perhaps most importantly, Pokémon. But despite its success, the Game Boy was beginning to show its age. The handheld gaming landscape was changing. Consumers were becoming accustomed to color screens, competing systems were offering more advanced hardware, and even Nintendo knew that the original Game Boy's technology couldn't last forever. The company needed an upgrade. The challenge was figuring out how to modernize the Game Boy without losing everything that made it successful in the first place. One of the biggest reasons Nintendo had dominated the handheld market wasn't because their hardware was the most powerful. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Nintendo had consistently chosen practical hardware over cutting-edge technology. While their competitors focused on color backlit screens and advanced processors, Nintendo focused on affordability, battery life, durability, and software. That strategy had worked remarkably well. So when Nintendo began designing the successor to the Game Boy, they didn't want to start all over. Instead, they wanted to evolve the formula, and the result was the Game Boy Color. Released in October of 1998, the Game Boy Color represented everything Nintendo had learned during the previous decade in handheld gaming. Rather than introducing a completely new platform, Nintendo created a system that felt familiar while addressing many of the original Game Boy limitations. The obvious change was right there in the name, color. At last, Nintendo's handheld players could enjoy games with vibrant visuals instead of the familiar greenish monochrome display that had defined portable gaming throughout the 1990s. For many gamers, this was the upgrade they had been waiting for. Despite its name, the Game Boy Color was more than simply a Game Boy with a colorful screen. Under the hood, Nintendo had made several important improvements. The processor ran much faster than the original Game Boy. Memory was expanded, and developers now had more flexibility when designing the games. And the color display could show dozens of colors from its large color palette. All these improvements allowed developers to create richer, more detailed worlds than ever before on the Game Boy. The games looked brighter, characters appeared more expressive, and the environments finally felt alive in ways that weren't possible on the original hardware. Yet, perhaps the most smart decision that Nintendo made had nothing to do with technology at all. The Game Boy Color remained fully compatible with nearly the entire Game Boy library. This meant players could continue enjoying the games they had already owned. For consumers,
it was an easy upgrade. And for Nintendo, it proved a seamless transition between generations. This backward compatibility would prove to be one of the system's greatest strengths. When the system launched in 1998, Pokemon fever was sweeping across the globe. Children were collecting trading cards, watching the animated series, trading monsters on the playground, and spending countless hours exploring Pokemon on their Game Boys. Nintendo couldn't have asked for a better moment to release new hardware. The Game Boy Color immediately benefited from the enormous popularity of the Pokemon franchise. Games like Pokemon Yellow looked fantastic on the new system, using enhanced color palettes that breathed new life into familiar adventures. Then came Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver. Released in Japan in 1999 and internationally shortly after, these games became some of the most important titles in handheld gaming history. For many players, they were the reason to own a Game Boy Color, and they helped cement Nintendo's dominance for years to come. While Pokemon may be the biggest attraction, it was far from the only reason gamers embraced the Game Boy Color. Nintendo and third-party developers quickly built an impressive software library. Games like The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX brought one of Nintendo's greatest adventures to the newest hardware with enhanced visuals. Wario Land 2 and Wario Land 3 showcased creative platforming and clever game design. Titles like Mario Tennis and Mario Golf proved that sports games could thrive on a handheld system. And third-party publishers continue supporting the platform with a wide variety of action, role-playing, puzzle, and licensed games. The Game Boy Color became a destination for players of all ages. Whether you wanted epic adventures, quick arcade-style experiences, or multiplayer competition through the link cable, there was something for everyone. Perhaps most importantly, the system maintained the qualities that had made the original Game Boy so successful. That was affordability, it was durable, and it offered excellent battery life. While competitors often struggled to balance performance and portability, Nintendo continued delivering a handheld that could travel almost anywhere. As the 1990s drew to a close, Nintendo once again found itself in a familiar position, on top. The Game Boy Color quickly became a commercial success. Consumers embraced the new hardware, retailers eagerly stocked it, developers supported it, and competitors found themselves facing the same challenge that existed for nearly a decade. How do you compete with Nintendo? And the answer? As many companies discovered, wasn't that easy, and the Game Boy Color arrived at the perfect time. It offered meaningful improvements over the original Game Boy and not abandoning its roots. It modernized handheld gaming without sacrificing affordability, and this thing delivered exactly what consumers wanted, nothing more and nothing less. Today, the Game Boy Color is remembered as one of Nintendo's most successful handheld systems. It helped bridge the gap between the original Game Boy era and the next generation of portable gaming. It introduced millions of players to some of the greatest handheld games ever created, and it demonstrated a lesson that Nintendo had learned long ago. Sometimes success isn't about having the most powerful hardware. It's about understanding what players actually wanted. The Game Boy Color wasn't the most advanced handheld of its generation. It wasn't the most innovative, and certainly it wasn't the most powerful. But what it did was build off the original Game Boy success. And that's why it succeeded, where so many others failed. By the late 1990s, Nintendo once again appeared unstoppable in the handheld gaming market. The Game Boy Color was flying off store shelves, Pokemon had become a worldwide phenomenon, and competing handheld manufacturers continued to struggle against Nintendo's dominance. But if there was one company that was not intimidated by Nintendo's success, it was SNK. For arcade gamers, SNK was already a legendary name. The company had spent years building a reputation for fast-paced action games, fighting games, and some of the most impressive arcade games of the era. Titles like Kings of Fighter, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and Metal Slug had helped establish SNK as one of the biggest names in arcade gaming. And through its arcade-perfect AES Neo Geo home console, SNK had earned a loyal following amongst dedicated gamers who wanted arcade-perfect experiences at home. Of course, those experiences came at a price, a very expensive price. The Neo Geo AES was famous for its incredible graphics and arcade-quality games, but its cost placed it well beyond the reach of most players. As the gaming industry evolved, SNK began looking for new opportunities. One of those opportunities was handheld gaming. And unlike some of Nintendo's previous competitors, SNK wasn't interested in simply creating another Game Boy clone. They wanted to bring the Neo Geo experience to the palm of your hand. In 1998, SNK launched the Neo Geo Pocket in Japan. At first glance, the system appeared somewhat conservative. Unlike Sega's Game Gear or Atari's Lynx, the original Neo Geo Pocket featured a monochrome display. This may have seemed like a strange decision during an era when color handhelds were becoming increasingly common, but SNK had learned an important lesson from Nintendo. Battery life mattered. A lot. The Neo Geo Pocket could deliver excellent battery performance while maintaining affordability and portability. Under the hood, the system featured surprisingly capable hardware. It was designed specifically for gaming rather than trying to serve as a multi-purpose device. And while its black and white screen may have appeared outdated, the system offered smooth gameplay and responsive controls. But there was one feature that immediately stood out: the control stick. Rather than using the traditional D-pad, SNK developed a miniature click stick that provided exceptional precision. Players could feel each directional input physically click into place. For fighting games especially, this design was a revelation. Many fans still consider it one of the finest handheld control mechanisms ever created. Unfortunately, despite its strengths, the original Neo Geo Pocket faced a significant problem. Nintendo had already announced the Game Boy Color, and once color handhelds became the new standard, SNK knew it needed to respond quickly. In 1999, less than a year after the original system's debut, SNK released the Neo Geo Pocket Color. The new model retained everything players loved about the original hardware while adding a vibrant color display. For many gamers, this was the system SNK should have launched from the beginning. The Neo Geo Pocket Color featured a bright screen, excellent battery life, comfortable ergonomics, and the same outstanding click-stick controls. It was lightweight, portable, and packed with personality. The hardware itself received praise from critics and players alike. But as we've seen throughout gaming history, great hardware is only part of the equation. A successful handheld also needs great games, and for SNK, that wasn't a problem. If there was one area SNK excelled at, it was software. The company's arcade heritage gave Neo Geo Pocket Color access to some of the most beloved franchises in gaming history. Games like Kings of Fighter Round 2 brought SNK's flagship fighting series to handhelds with impressive results. Samurai Showdown 2 delivered fast-paced weapon-based combat. SNK vs. Capcom Match of the Millennium would eventually become one of the most celebrated handheld fighting games ever released. Meanwhile, games like Metal Slug First Mission and Metal Slug Second Mission successfully translated the chaotic run-and-gun action games of the arcade originals into a portable form. What impressed many players wasn't just the quality of these games, it was how faithfully they captured the spirit of their arcade counterparts. Developers found clever ways to adapt complex arcade experiences to handheld hardware without sacrificing what made those games so fun. The result was a library that felt uniquely SNK. Colorful, fast, stylish, and surprisingly deep. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Neo Geo Pocket Color might carve out a meaningful niche alongside Nintendo's hardware. Critics praised the system, gamers who owned it loved it, and word of mouth was generally positive. Unfortunately, powerful forces were working against SNK. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's biggest challenge wasn't its hardware or its games. The biggest problem was its timing. By 1999, Nintendo's handheld ecosystem had become enormous. The Game Boy Color was dominating retail shelves. Pokémon was driving hardware sales to unprecedented levels, and of course, third-party publishers naturally gravitated toward a platform with the largest audience. As a result, many developers simply ignored competing handheld systems. Even a well-designed handheld like the Neo Geo Pocket Color struggled to gain visibility. Consumers walking into stores often saw rows of Game Boy products and only a small selection of Neo Geo Pocket titles. And while dedicated enthusiasts appreciated SNK's efforts, the mainstream audience largely remained focused on Nintendo. Then came another problem. SNK itself was facing financial difficulties. The arcade market was changing, and the company began experiencing serious business challenges. These issues ultimately limited the support and resources available for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. By 2001, the Neo Geo Pocket Color had effectively reached its end of life. Production had ceased and software releases began to slow, and the handheld quietly disappeared from the market. Commercially, it really could never compete with Nintendo's dominance, but unlike many of the failed handheld systems, the Neo Geo Pocket Color left behind an extraordinary legacy. Over the years, retro gamers have rediscovered the platform,
collectors seek out its games and fans continue praising its controls. And many players who missed it during its original run have come back to appreciate just how special it really was. In fact, ask a group of retro gamers to name the most underrated handheld of all time, and the Neo Geo Pocket Color will almost certainly appear near the top of the list. Not because it sold millions of units or changed the industry, but because it delivered an exceptional gaming experience that deserved far more attention than it ever received. Although some of these systems failed commercially, their influence can still be felt today. Modern-day handhelds such as the Nintendo Switch, the Steam Deck, or even our modern-day cell phones, we see these pieces of technology within them. Together they represent a fascinating time in gaming history, a period filled with experimentation, innovation, and competition, a time when companies were still trying to figure out what the future of handheld gaming was. And if you guys are digging the content, don't forget to hit that like, that subscribe, that notification bell, and that hype as well. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a member or leaving a super down below. Alright guys, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I hope you enjoyed the content. You guys have a great one. Peace out, y'all.
Game over, man. It's game over.